first sound missing was not silence, but the absence of something older than breath. The villagers swore they had risen before dawn, just as they always did, to hear the bronze-throated bells roll their mournful voices across the fields. But on that morning, when the mist still clung to the earth like shrouds left out to dry, there was nothing. No toll, no echo, no reminder that the church still kept its place at the center of their lives. The air itself had grown thick, as if the weight of unsung hymns pressed down upon every chest. It was said the bells were forged in blood, centuries before, their metal mixed with the rings and chains of the dead. They had never failed to sound, not in famine, nor plague, nor fire. Yet on the day Annabelle Grayson opened her mouth to speak, they fell still. The priest, Father Morrow, stood alone in the belfry, his hands blistering from rope that refused to pull sound from the iron throats. He tugged until the skin split between his fingers, until the rope fibers chewed his palms raw. But the clappers inside swung like bones without marrow, heavy, hollow, yielding nothing. His curses caught in his throat, and though he would later claim he prayed, he knew in that moment prayer had abandoned him. Down below, the villagers gathered in the fog, their faces drawn pale, their breath visible as if the very air had soured, whispers threaded between them, furtive and sharp as needles. It began when she spoke. God did not make her tongue. Something in her words stops the bells. Annabelle stood among them, barefoot on the damp stone path, her hair undone, her eyes unblinking. She was not yet 12, but her presence seemed older than the church itself. When she parted her lips, her voice came not like a child's, but like the dragging of iron across a crypt floor. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her words trembling through the crowd, though she did not raise her voice. "It is not silence, it is listening." And indeed, the villagers swore afterward that the silence was not absence, but attention. It felt alive. It seemed to crouch between them, pressing its ear against every heartbeat, waiting for confessions never spoken aloud. Father Morrow stumbled down from the belfry, his cassock torn, his hands bleeding. He looked not at the people, but at Annabelle, as though all else had fallen into shadow. "You will not speak here," he whispered, though his voice trembled. "This is God's house." Annabelle tilted her head, her face unreadable. Her lips moved again, and the sound was softer than breath, yet it reached them all. Then why has he stopped listening? A murmur spread through the crowd like a sickness. The old women clutched their beads, pressing crucifixes to lips gone bloodless. Men spat into the dirt as if to expel what they had heard. Children buried their faces against their mothers' skirts, though some peeked through fingers, drawn in fear to the girl who had unstrung the bells. That night, the village lay restless. No prayers seemed to land. No hymns rose higher than the rafters. In the darkness, every household claimed they heard faint tremors, shudders of bronze far away, as if the bells were ringing not in the tower, but beneath the ground. The sound was muffled, as though the earth itself carried echoes of a hidden toll. Annabelle was seen walking the lanes after midnight, her pale dress trailing in the dust. Some swore she moved without footsteps. Others claimed she stood beneath the church tower, staring up at the mute bells, her mouth working soundlessly, as though bargaining with the silence itself. By dawn, Father Morrow had nailed shut the church doors. His sermon that morning was shouted from the steps, his voice breaking as he declared, "No child of Eve shall bring stillness to God's house. She is a vessel unclean, a mouth unblessed." But the villagers did not look to him. They looked to the tower. They looked to the mute bronze throats that once sang of weddings, deaths, and the passing of seasons. And they saw that the bells still swayed gently, though no wind moved. Annabelle stood apart, her small face lit by the early sun, though it did not warm her. She turned toward the people, lips curving in what might have been a smile or a warning, and in that moment every ear heard, not sound, but the absence of sound taking shape. The silence thickened, swelled, and seemed almost to breathe. It pressed into skulls, seeped into marrow. It carried with it a single, unvoiced promise. The bells would ring again, but not for the living. Her voice entered not through the ear, but through the marrow. The villagers swore they could taste it, black and acrid, coating their tongues as if they had swallowed the smoke of a burned chapel. Each word Annabelle Grayson spoke left behind a residue, a bitter powder clinging to lips and throats. Mothers pulled their children away when she passed, for even the smallest whisper, the syllables of her own name, left them coughing as though they had swallowed cinders. It was at the market square where the first man collapsed. Elias Broom, a farmer whose skin was leathered by years in the fields, stood too near as Annabelle muttered beneath her breath. He spat suddenly onto the cobblestones, expecting bile, but what fell from his mouth was darker, grainy and thick with soot. His knees buckled, his eyes rolled white, and when they lifted him, his tongue was blistered as though it had pressed against flame. He lived 3 days more, each night crying that the girl's voice still crawled inside his skull, whispering hymns backward. The people demanded Father Morrow intervene. He came to Annabelle at dusk, when the shadows stretched long and crooked, his vestments dragged in the dust, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He raised a crucifix before her as though it might cage the sound in her throat. "You will not speak again," he told her, his voice quaking. "The breath in your lungs is not yours." Annabelle tilted her head, the setting sun glinting against the glassiness of her gaze. Her lips parted, and the hush that fell over the square was sharper than steel. Every villager leaned forward unwillingly, as if drawn closer by invisible cords, desperate and terrified to hear what should not be heard. "Do you not wonder," she whispered, her voice softer than the settling of ash, "what was burned, that you taste it still?" The priest staggered as though struck. The crucifix in his hand grew heavy, his arm trembling. Around them, the crowd coughed violently, spitting streaks of red into their palms. Some fell to their knees, clutching at their throats. The air itself seemed full of soot, though no fire had burned in the village for days. By nightfall, the sickness had spread. Those who had heard her whisper dreamt of black smoke curling beneath their eyelids, suffocating them. Children woke screaming, their sheets damp with blood coughed from lungs too small to hold so much ash. A young girl was found dead by morning, her lips stained grey, her mouth still warm with the taste of burned hymns. The people began to bury their Bibles, believing the pages had caught her curse. Pages blackened overnight, words smearing like ink dragged through flame. One book, when thrown upon the fire, did not burn. It wept soot, filling the cottage with choking clouds, until the family fled into the fields. Annabelle walked through it all as though untouched, her white dress unsoiled, her bare feet silent on the cobbles. To some she seemed innocent, a lamb led astray. To others she was the wolf itself, cloaked in the guise of childhood. Her silence was unbearable, yet her words were worse. One evening Father Morrow confronted her again, this time before the closed doors of the church. He tried to bind her mouth with cloth, praying as he did so, but each word of scripture he spoke withered in his throat. His voice cracked, turned hollow, and he fell coughing, choking, until he too spat blood darkened with ash. The cloth slipped useless from her lips, and Annabelle leaned close, her whisper so near it seemed to come from inside him. "You bleed because you listen. You bleed because you believe." The priest's scream was thin, almost voiceless. He fled into the night, his footsteps swallowed by the heavy quiet. None saw him again until weeks later, when his cassock was found tangled in the branches of the old oak at the edge of the graveyard, stiffened with soot and blood. By then the villagers had stopped speaking aloud. Every voice carried the risk of summoning ash, every word a reminder of the girl's whispers. They communicated in gestures, in scratches upon wood, in prayers mouthed silently. Only Annabelle's voice still threaded through the streets, thin as smoke, curling through shutters, seeping beneath doors. They said the silence now had weight, pressing on chests, making each breath sharp and desperate. And always, beneath it, the faint taste of soot lingered. On the 7th night, a boy named Samuel dared to ask her what secret she carried that spoiled the air. Annabelle's mouth curved almost kindly before she bent to whisper against his ear. The boy screamed once, a high keening sound, then clawed at his own throat until his nails broke. When they dragged him away, his lips were cracked, his teeth blackened, and every cough painted the stones with blood. Annabelle turned to the gathering crowd, her voice soft and cruelly sweet. He asked, and I answered. Now his mouth too is full of ashes. The villagers scattered in terror, but her words clung to them like smoke to hair, impossible to wash away. They swore her whispers had no ending, that even when she fell silent, her words continued, buried in the marrow of those who heard. And still, each morning, when the sun rose pale above the village, the air reeked faintly of burned hymns, and the people spat blood into the earth. At last, someone noticed the church candles had begun to weep black. The first flame died with a hiss like a creature drowning. It was during Vespers, when the villagers had gathered by force of habit, though their prayers had already begun to rot in their mouths. They lit the altar candles as they always did, hoping the familiar glow might drive away the soot that haunted their lungs. Yet the moment Annabelle stepped into the chapel, barefoot, her eyes unreadable in the candlelight, the flames faltered. The once white tapers guttered, trembling like frightened things, their light paling into a sickly yellow before collapsing into black tears. Wax streamed down in thick, tar-like rivulets pooling at the base of the crucifix, staining the altar cloth until it looked as though the wood itself bled corruption. The air reeked of smoke, not sweet like incense but acrid, like the burning of wet hair and bones. Mothers shielded their children, whispering, "Don't look, don't look," though every gaze was drawn helplessly to the blackened candles. Father Morrow, gaunt and sleepless since the bells had died, raised a trembling hand to steady the largest candle. His eyes glistened with something between faith and madness. He bent close, ear nearly brushing the flame. Later, those who dared stay claimed they heard it with him. A faint, shrill cry like the squeal of an animal caught in iron teeth. The candles scream, the priest rasped, falling back, clutching his chest as if struck. His voice cracked, echoing against the stone vaults. The candles scream before they die. The villagers recoiled, muttering prayers that curdled into sobs. They begged him to douse them, but Father Morrow staggered forward again, gripping the iron candlestand with bloodied hands. "These are God's lights," he croaked. "They burn because his hand wills it." But Annabelle only stood at the foot of the altar, her face pale, her lips parted as though drinking in the shrieks no one else wanted to hear. Her shadow stretched unnaturally long behind her, blackening the floor, curling like smoke into the corners of the chapel. One by one, the flames collapsed into oily darkness, each extinguished with a sound like a throat cut mid-song. The last candle lingered, its flame writhing violently, spitting sparks. Then, as Father Morrow reached toward it, the wick flared once, blinding white before exhaling into silence. A final drop of tar-thick wax slid down, landing upon his hand. He screamed as his skin blistered, though no fire had touched him. From the darkness, Annabelle's voice drifted soft and steady, carrying without effort through the thick silence. They cry because they know their light is false. Her words spread like cold smoke through every chest. A boy fainted. An old woman dropped her rosary, the beads scattering across the stones like seeds spilled for crows. In the weeks that followed, no candle would stay lit in the village. Wedding feasts held in shadow, funerals without flame. Even the humble hearths in kitchens sputtered and spat black, staining the pots and pans as though the fire itself had turned to coal. Some claimed to hear faint cries whenever they struck flint, tiny screams buried in the spark, silenced as soon as flame caught. The church, once a place of refuge, became an archive of dripping tar. The altar cloth never came clean. Every attempt to scrub it only smeared the black further. Stains climbed the walls like creeping vines, and parishioners swore they saw faces forming in the hardened wax, mouths open, eyes wide, caught mid-cry. Father Morrow persisted in his prayers, though his voice broke often, swallowed by coughs. His hands never healed, always blistered, always raw, as though the wax still burned him. One night, in desperation, he set an entire circle of candles around Annabelle, where she knelt before the altar. The villagers held their breath, watching. The flames leapt high, brighter than any had seen in months. For a moment, hope stirred. Then Annabelle looked up, her gaze catching the light. Every flame bent toward her. The circle of fire shuddered, screamed, an unmistakable, piercing sound that filled the chapel like 100 dying throats, and in an instant, each candle burst. Wax sprayed outward, scalding the skin of those who stood too near. The stench of charred cloth and seared flesh filled the air. Screams echoed, but this time they were human. Annabelle remained unmarked. She rose slowly as though lifted not by her own strength, but by some invisible hand, and whispered, "Their light was never yours. It belongs to the dark now." From that night on, the villagers swore the chapel glowed faintly, even in absence of flame, not with light, but with the memory of fire, black shadows writhing on the walls as though smoke had learned to dance. And when a brave few ventured near the altar, they claimed the crucifix itself had begun to soften, its wooden body sweating black resin like the candles before it. The Christ upon the cross seemed to sag under invisible weight, his face contorted in silent grief. But it was not grief the people feared. It was the sound that came after. In the stillness, when the dripping wax ceased, a faint groan deep within the wood, a slow bending, as though the cross itself strained towards something it should never bow to. It began with the eyes refusing to meet the faithful. The villagers noticed first in silence, as they knelt in the chapel that no longer knew the warmth of candles. Christ, once painted with eyes gentle and full of sorrow, now gazed away, not up to heaven nor down upon his flock, but sideways, toward the girl who stood in the pews like a shadow given flesh. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men bowed their heads deeper, pretending not to see what they saw. But whispers spread like damp rot through the rafters. The Son of God would not look upon them. The priest, trembling, insisted it was the fault of age, that paint cracked, colors bled, wood warped. Yet no hand of man could explain why the saints in the stained glass twisted as though writhing from within. Their mouths, once shaped in solemn blessing, now curled open in silent screams. Fingers raised in benediction bent away, recoiling, as though afraid to touch the air that Annabelle Grayson breathed. On the third day, the Virgin herself turned, her painted eyes, once cast heavenward in radiant devotion, rolled askew, glancing sidelong with a look that could only be described as dread. A parishioner screamed aloud during morning prayer, swearing he saw the Virgin's lips tremble as if whispering. He fled the chapel, and though the priest tried to hush the panic, soon no villager could kneel without feeling the suffocating certainty that every holy image was straining, twisting, recoiling from them, from her, from all Father Morrow forbade the people from speaking of it. But he too was seen standing in the chapel alone at night, shaking, clutching his rosary so hard the beads left bloodied circles in his palms. Some swore they heard him begging aloud, "Look at me, please look at me, Lord," but no painted eye turned his way. Annabelle, however, seemed to walk as though guided by their shifting gazes. She lingered before each mural, each window, tilting her head, smiling faintly as the faces bent away. "Why are you afraid?" she whispered once, her small voice threading through the cavernous dark. "You were made to watch." Those who overheard swore the stained glass rattled, though no wind stirred. One dusk, as the last shred of sun filtered through the windows, the villagers gasped. The light itself had changed. No longer did the glass scatter warm reds and golds upon the stone floor. Instead, it cast pallid hues of green and blue, twisted shapes that resembled not saints, but serpents coiling across the pews. Their shadows slithered over skin and wood alike, and children wept as they tried to brush them away. From that night forward, none dared enter the chapel alone. Yet even outside its walls the unease spread. Crucifixes in homes tipped forward, their nails loosening as though the walls themselves rejected them. Icons dulled, faces eroding into blank wood, until even the holiest relics stared not at heaven but at the ground. And still, Annabelle's gaze never faltered. She walked among the ruined saints as if among kin. One night, Father Morrow called the bravest of the men to strip the chapel bare. They climbed ladders, hammering at the frames, pulling down Christ, St. Peter, Mary Magdalene, St. Jude, every painted witness. But as each image fell, the men swore they heard a faint groan like wood protesting burial. When the last canvas was pried loose, it split not with the softness of cloth but with the sickening tear of flesh. From the darkness behind, eyes opened, dozens, pale and glistening, embedded deep in the stone. Human, yet not human. They blinked sluggishly, like creatures waking from centuries of sleep. Their gaze shifting, away from the villagers, always away, until they too fixed upon Annabelle. The men dropped their tools, stumbling backward, choking on terror. One fainted. Another clawed his own face, as if to rip away what he had seen. The priest fell to his knees, clutching the hem of Annabelle's dress, begging, "Tell me what you are, child. Tell me what they see." Annabelle leaned close, her whisper carrying like incense in the thickened air. "They do not see me. They see what follows me." The eyes in the stone rolled upward in unison, turning not toward heaven but toward the rafters. The villagers followed their gaze, trembling. There in the rafters, high above the altar, something shifted. Not wings, not cloth, not shadow. Something heavier, something waiting. Its presence pressed down like a storm, though no form could yet be seen. Only the faint, steady dripping of black wax upon the stones gave proof that it had already begun to descend. The ground trembled as if it had been waiting, patient for the sound of her truth. Annabelle knelt upon the cold stone of the chapel floor, her small palms pressed flat against its smooth surface. The air thickened around her, heavy with the coppery scent of old blood and dust. Outside, the wind moaned through the village, but inside, silence held the congregation captive. A silence so dense it pressed against the rib cages of those who dared breathe. Every eye was drawn to the girl, who leaned forward and whispered something too low for human ears, yet heavy enough to bend the very stones beneath her. At first the chapel quaked lightly, a subtle vibration that ran through the pews and made the candles shiver. Then came a groan, deep and resonant, as though the church itself were drawing in a lungful of despair. The floor cracked, not a simple fracture, but a spreading network of veins, fissures widening and twisting like roots reaching into darkness. The people screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the weight of the stone. Father Morrow fell to his knees, clutching the altar rail as though it were a lifeboat. By God, by God, by... His prayers fractured against the groaning earth. The congregation tried to rise, but the cracks licked at their feet, pulling at their shoes, their skirts, as if the floor sought to consume them. Annabelle did not flinch. Her face was pale and still, as if carved from marble, yet her eyes glimmered with a secret too vast, too old to name. "It listens," she murmured, almost reverently. "It remembers." The floor responded, cracking deeper, the veins swallowing the dust and spilled incense. From the chasms came a sound, not just a groan but a chorus of voices, muted, hoarse, layered in time. The villagers recognized some of the timbre, the long-dead choir boys, the priests who had vanished in the last great storm, the voices of infants buried in the graveyard beneath the churchyard soil. Each whispered the things left unsaid, the sins and confessions never carried to God. A child screamed. Old hands clawed at the floor, trying to stop the fissures from widening. The cracks hissed, as if spitting fire into the chapel, and every drop of candle wax that fell now boiled into black smoke, curling upward in twisting shapes. Shadows bent unnaturally, forming faces writhing in agony, mouths open but silent, reaching toward the congregation. Father Morrow crawled toward Annabelle, dragging himself over the trembling stones. "Child, child, what have you done? Speak." Her whisper, now louder, slid through the air like oil. I only told them what they had buried. The floor split further, swallowing kneeling parishioners to their waists. They clawed at the edges, screaming, their cries joining the chorus emerging from the earth. Father Morrow tried to grab Annabelle, but she drew back, and the stone between them bubbled, blackened and split, forcing him to stumble. The church walls shivered. Stained glass rattled in their frames, the faces of saints twisting again, eyes wide in terror. The crucifix leaned as though recoiling from the girl, shadows swallowing the Christ figure's face. Wax dripped from melted candles, joining the cracks in sticky rivulets, and the sound of the floor splitting was punctuated by faint, metallic clicks like bones grinding beneath stone. Annabelle lowered her head and whispered again, "Do you hear it? Here swallows everything you hide." From beneath the largest crack the ground moved, slithering, almost liquid. Something ancient, heavy and unnamed writhed within, a presence older than the church, older than the village. It pulsed with every word she spoke, every secret drawn from the marrow of the faithful. The fissures spread into the walls, curling like serpents, reaching for the pulpit, the pews, the priest. A woman in the back fell through a widening crack, screaming, and vanished. Another child's hands disappeared into the stone, as if the floor had remembered a debt long owed. The priest screamed, trying to clutch Annabelle one last time, but she rose, as though lifted by the earth itself. And then the voice came, not hers, not the priest's, not the choir boys, but something lower, something from the roots of the world. It hungers, it remembers. It waits. The chapel tilted slightly, the ceiling groaning, and the villagers realized with terror that the floor had not merely cracked, it had begun to unmake the building itself, dissolving it like sand in water. Dust and blackened debris swirled around them, and from the depths of the chasms, faint green light shone, illuminating skeletal shapes too tall, too thin, too sharp-jointed to be human. Annabelle stepped toward the largest fissure, and as she did, the light from it pulsed. The shadows of the walls reached out toward her, grasping, pulling, bending the figures of saints and pews alike. She did not retreat. "It waits for all who speak, all who lie, all who hide," she whispered, her voice now merging with the rumble beneath. The priest, trembling, muttered, "God forgive us." The earth answered, gurgling, as a hand, not human but impossibly long and thin, climbed from the deepest crack, its fingertips brushing the air above the altar. It trembled, quivering, before sinking back into the darkness. The villagers fell silent, paralyzed by the sight. All eyes were on Annabelle, whose pale lips curled in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The blackened fissures pulsed and whispered, promising, always promising, and the floor continued to shift, waiting for its next confession to drink. The night arrived not with darkness but with voices. It began as a murmur, a rustling whisper that slithered through the village like smoke. At first the villagers thought it wind, or the low hum of the church settling on its fractured foundation. But when the voices grew louder, overlapping and thick, they realized the air itself was speaking, and the words did not belong to any living tongue. Annabelle Grayson wandered the cobblestone streets, barefoot, her pale dress ghostly in the moonlight. Wherever she passed, the wind seemed to carry the dead with it, each breath laden with syllables from mouths long closed. The voices, men who had died in wars centuries past, women buried in unmarked graves, wove around her, blending into a chorus of lamentation and warning. But their pleas were garbled, tangled into curses no ear should understand, and those who tried to listen too closely fell to their knees, convulsing as the words burrowed into their minds. Father Morrow watched from the church steps, his cassock fluttering in the night wind. He had barricaded the doors, hoping to protect the congregation, yet even here the voices slipped in. He whispered prayers, but each syllable turned black on his tongue, twisting into the voices of the dead. "Release us! Release us!" Slightly moaned, but the sound split and fractured into jagged hisses. "Lie! Bleed! Burn!" In the village square the air thickened. Lanterns flickered, smoke curling upward in thin spirals that smelled faintly of ash and iron. People pressed against doors and walls, their ears ringing as the chorus grew, filling every alley and chamber. Those brave enough to peek from their windows saw Annabelle standing in the center, her small arms raised slightly, as though conducting the unseen multitude. Her head tilted, lips moving in a rhythm not her own, and the villagers swore that 40 or perhaps more voices rose from her mouth in a single, impossible torrent. "Speak," she whispered, and it was not her voice alone. 40 tongues answered, each layered atop the other, some wailing in grief, some screaming with anger. The words tangled, a knot of curses that sank into the minds of those who listened. One man clutched his head and screamed, a wordless sound of torment, before collapsing face first onto the cobblestones. Frothing at the mouth, Father Morrow staggered forward, calling her name, but the girl did not turn. Instead, the shadows around her deepened, thickening like smoke from a grave freshly opened. From the darkness, shapes began to emerge, pale hands reaching upward, eyes blinking in the black, mouths whispering alongside her chorus. The dead, it seemed, had learned to walk again, tethered to her voice. "You hear us," Annabelle whispered, "and you will not forget." Her words, borrowed, shared, multiplied, entered the minds of the living, burrowing like worms through bone. Villagers fell to their knees, clutching their ears, trying in vain to block the voices. The whispers were no longer pleas. They were demands, dragging the living into the memory of the dead. One woman sobbed as her own mother's voice called from a grave she had never visited. Another child heard her father screaming for a debt she could not pay. The priest stepped closer, desperate. "Annabelle, stop this! I command you in the name of God!" For a moment, the voices faltered, a single thread of silence threading through the cacophony. Then the girl's lips parted, and the chorus surged again, louder, angrier, more tangled than before. "Lie, bleed, burn, wait, take," they hissed. The ground shook, small cracks running along the stones, echoing the fractures in the church that had begun weeks ago. Lanterns toppled, spilling molten light onto the cobblestones, igniting small patches of dried straw and dust. Flames licked the edges of the chapel steps, yet no one dared move closer. The dead did not fear fire. Annabelle lifted her head, her gaze sweeping over the terrified villagers. In that moment, the voices seemed to come from inside her, yet also from everywhere at once, from the rooftops, the streets, the walls, the very stones beneath their feet. 40, 50, 100 tongues, all speaking in impossible unison. Each word, each plea, each curse, a chain linking the living to the dead. Father Morrow fell to the ground, clutching his head. "What have we done?" he moaned. "What have we allowed?" The voices surged, each syllable a lash against the ears, the mind, the soul. Some villagers screamed, clawing at their mouths, their eyes wide and unseeing. One man tried to flee, only to stumble into a fissure in the earth that had opened beneath the square weeks ago. The darkness swallowed him, and when the villagers looked again, his hands were dragging, clawing at the edges of stone from below, the mouth frozen in a silent scream. Annabelle remained still, serene, almost pleased, her small figure surrounded by a swirling maelstrom of tongues and shadows. Her whisper rose above all else, soft and melodic, yet impossible to ignore. They spoke once. "Now you must listen." And in the stillness that followed, the villagers realized the voices did not stop when she did. They lingered, twisting in the shadows, curling around the corners of rooms, clinging to walls, following every footstep, every breath. Even when the girl vanished into the night, the chorus remained, a reminder that the dead were no longer silent. The moon cast a thin, sickly light over the village, illuminating cracks that had grown in the streets, each pulsing faintly as if breathing. From the largest fissure came a sound like whispered syllables, not quite human, not quite stone. We wait. We remember. We speak. And somewhere unseen a single candle guttered, dripping black wax onto the ground, staining the earth with its secrets. The first note was not sung, but carved into the air with the scream of iron. The choir boy, thin and pale, had taken the church hymnal in trembling hands, thinking to practice his part before the morning service. The leather cover felt slick beneath his fingers, almost alive, as if breathing faintly. When he opened it, the pages were not white but darkened with a wetness that gleamed under the candlelight. Blood, he realized too late, seeping between the lines of music, staining the notes as though the saints themselves had bled onto the paper. His mouth went dry. His breath caught, rattling in his throat, but the book seemed to pulse in response, each page whispering faintly, a sound no human voice could produce. The notes lifted from the paper, twisting in the air like writhing worms, screeching with a melody that was not melody, a rhythm that was not rhythm. The choir boy tried to scream, but the sound was drowned beneath the hymn of something older than the church itself. From the shadows, Annabelle watched, small and still, her gaze fixed on the book as though she had commanded it from birth. "It remembers," she whispered, voice almost soft enough to be drowned by the rustling of the pages. "It tastes the sins you left unsaid." The boy's fingers went numb. He tried to close the hymnal, but it clung to his palms, its wet pages sticking, pulling, unwilling to be shut. The notes twisted further, rising into the air, forming shapes too horrible to name. Hands, faces, mouths, all singing silently, pleading for something lost. Each smear of red seemed to move, crawling across the page like veins, extending outward toward him. Father Morrow arrived just as the first page seemed to reach for the boy's throat. His hands trembled as he reached forward, chanting prayers under his breath. But the hymnal ignored him. Its melody, if it could be called that, was a dirge for the living, a requiem for sins unconfessed, a lament that clutched at the marrow. "Stop!" he shouted. The word broke in the air, twisted by the sound of the book becoming stop. "Bleed. Remember." The boy fell to his knees, shaking, the hymnal open against the stone floor. Blood dripped from his hands, though he had not cut himself. The notes blurred and smeared, forming strange shapes. Letters in a language no man could speak, eyes opening in the margins, mouths moving as though the paper itself breathed. The priest recoiled, tripping over a fallen pew, the echo of the hymnal's voice following him down the aisle like claws across stone. Villagers had begun to gather outside the chapel, drawn by the screams and the unnatural sounds. Some swore they could hear the notes weaving through the night air, wrapping around their homes, seeping beneath doors, rustling curtains with wet fingers. Others claimed that when they pressed their ears to the walls, they could hear their own sins sung back to them. Notes sharp and unforgiving. The choir boy tried to rise, but the book clung to him, wrapping around his wrists as though alive, its pages slick and warm. He whispered, choking, It won't stop." Annabelle stepped forward, small and serene as if the chaos around her were merely a curtain lifted by the wind. She placed her hand on the hymnal, and for a moment the pages stilled. But the blood on the notes began to ripple, forming words in shapes that were almost human, almost angelic, but not quite. "We see you. We remember you. We hunger." Father Morrow lunged, clutching the girl, hoping to wrest the curse away. But the moment he touched her, the pages erupted into motion, spraying droplets of black and red across the altar and the priest's vestments. Screams erupted as more villagers pushed through the doors, eyes wide, hands pressed to mouths, yet even they could not turn away from the dancing. Bleeding notes. The choir boy's voice, once soft and trembling, joined the hymn as if the book had claimed him entirely. But it was not his voice alone. 40, 50 voices rose with his, some angelic, some guttural, some long dead, their syllables tangled in a single, dreadful chorus, every note struck with the weight of guilt, pressing into the chests of the onlookers, suffocating, bending the room around them. Annabelle whispered again, and the words threaded through the cacophony, "Sing if you can, sing if you dare, all else will bleed." The priest fell backward, covering his ears, but the melody seeped into his skull, into the walls, into the very stones beneath him. The black wax from the candles, already disturbed by her presence, began to drip faster, sizzling as it hit the bleeding pages. Shadows stretched across the walls, forming shapes that resembled twisted choir boys, their mouths open in eternal silent screams. The villagers began to run, some fleeing into the night, others collapsing in the pews, clutching at each other as if physical contact could stave off the curse. Yet the hymn followed them. Through the open doors, across the square, down narrow alleys, it clung to them, alive and relentless, never ceasing. And then the book flung itself from the choir boy's hands, landing open on the altar. The notes rose, writhing like living worms, twisting into the shape of a face, human yet horrifically wrong. The face opened its mouth in a silent scream, black blood oozing from its eyes, its jaw stretching impossibly wide. Annabelle smiled faintly, stepping closer to the altar. "It sings because it remembers. It bleeds because you forgot." And from the shadows behind the altar, something moved, a shape taller than the ceiling, darker than the deepest night. Its presence pressed against the walls, curling the candlelight back, bending the edges of the room. The hymn, the blood, the book, all froze for a heartbeat, and the villagers realized the chapel itself was listening. The night air smelled of rot before the coffins even appeared. It began at the edge of the village, where the mist clung thick to the fields like wet cloth. One by one, villagers emerged from their homes, drawn by the sound of wood scraping stone and a hollow thumping, a heartbeat too slow, too deliberate to be human. There, moving through the fog, came the procession. Dark, heavy coffins borne on trembling shoulders, each polished to an unnatural shine, each sealed as if guarding something sacred or profane. Yet the villagers knew no one had died. No plague, no war, no accident claimed the souls that might belong inside. And still the coffins knocked, deep raps echoing through the night, as if the dead themselves demanded release. The first coffin wobbled as it was carried past the church, and a muffled voice echoed from within. Not speaking, not singing, just a thrum, a desperate pulse. Someone screamed, backing away, and the coffin thumped again, louder, as if responding to the fear. Annabelle Grayson walked at the head of the procession, barefoot, her dress floating behind her in the mist like a spectral banner. Her face was calm, her eyes distant, yet the villagers felt the weight of her gaze as a pressure against their chests. Wherever she passed, the earth seemed to moan, the cobblestones shivering under the weight of unseen feet. "They are not empty," she whispered, voice soft as dry leaves. "They are only waiting." The villagers dared not look inside. Some swore they glimpsed shapes pressed against the wood, hands pale and skeletal, faces hollow, eyes wide and desperate. Others swore the knocking came in patterns, messages they could not understand but recognized as warnings. The sound of fingernails tapping against the lid was relentless, echoing against walls and trees and the stones of the churchyard, impossible to ignore. Father Morrow staggered forward, trying to halt the procession. "Stop this! You are leading them to ruin," he shouted, his voice cracking like old timber. But Annabelle did not pause. The coffins continued, rolling over the cobblestones, knocking from within as though they carried not death, but some cursed essence, alive and clamoring for release. A coffin jarred violently. The lid creaked and a low gurgling sound rose from inside. The villagers froze, horrified, as the shaking intensified. From the wood, a black ichor seeped, dripping onto the cobbles in thick rivulets that sizzled where it touched the mist. Those closest gagged at the scent, the smell of decay, smoke, and something far older, something ancient. Crawling from beneath the earth, Annabelle lifted her head, and the knocking stopped for a heartbeat. The silence was absolute, heavier than stone, pressing into the hearts of all who watched. Then she whispered, "They call for what you cannot give. They call for what has never been buried." The coffins began to move on their own. No bearers remained. Men and women, frightened and frozen, stepped aside. But the caskets rolled forward, bumping against one another, knocking as if alive. From within came faint voices, cries, whispers in languages the villagers had long forgotten. One child pressed her hand to her ears, but even her palms did not block the sound, and the whispers seemed to crawl beneath her skin, tickling her bones. Father Morrow fell to his knees, clutching his crucifix, and muttered prayers that sounded hollow, swallowed by the thudding and scratching from inside the coffins. The black wax from the candles in the churchyard began to seep outward, coiling around the procession like snakes, dripping onto the stones and soaking the edges of the caskets. Shadows stretched from them, bending toward the coffins, reaching with clawed fingers that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The largest coffin, polished ebony, rattled violently. The lid lifted slightly, then slammed shut. A scream erupted, not human, not wholly dead, but somewhere in between. It reverberated across the village, hollow and twisting, curling into every alley, piercing every shuttered window. The villagers stumbled backward, some vomiting, others fainting. Even the priest screamed, clutching Annabelle, shaking her as if to force the truth from her small body. "Open them," she whispered, calm and terrible. "See what waits for the living." The ground trembled beneath the procession, tiny cracks forming in the stones of the square. The coffins rattled as though the earth itself joined their knocking, the sound amplified by the blackened roots beneath the village. From the deepest fissures came a low, almost imperceptible hum, like a chorus of bones grinding together, vibrating the soles of the terrified villagers' feet. And then, one coffin rolled forward, lid sliding open on its own. Inside, the villagers glimpsed darkness so absolute, it seemed to pull at the edges of reality. Shapes moved within, thin, pale hands reaching upward, twisting, writhing, though no one could say if it was a single being or many. The air grew thick with cold, as if the very breath of the earth had been drawn into that hollow space. Annabelle's whisper rose above the cacophony. "Do you see them? They have waited long enough, and now, so will you." The procession moved forward, unstoppable, carrying its empty but living coffins through the village. The villagers scattered, some fleeing toward the woods, some cowering in homes, but all were followed by the hollow knocking, the desperate whispers, the black ichor that stained stones and walls alike. From above, the church tower groaned as if watching, the belfry tilting slightly, its bronze bells long silenced, now rattling faintly in resonance with the empty caskets. Shadows leapt from every corner, stretching toward the coffins, clutching, grasping, never letting go. And as the procession passed, one final, horrifying image burned into every eye. The lid of the largest coffin lifted completely, and from within a pale, faceless hand reached outward, beckoning. The crucifix shuddered before it moved. In the dim, wavering candlelight of the chapel, every eye was drawn to the altar. The great wooden crucifix, once a symbol of divine constancy, quivered like a creature sensing prey. Then, with a slow, deliberate creak that reverberated through stone and bone alike, it bent backward, not toward heaven, but toward Annabelle. The shadow it cast stretched impossibly long, swallowing pews, kneelers, even the trembling villagers crouched beneath it. The scent of incense curdled in the air, thick and bitter, mingling with the coppery tang of fear. Father Morrow fell to his knees, clutching his crucifix, his prayers stuttering against a rising tide of dread. "It cannot bend. God would not allow it." His voice shook, weak against the weight of what was unfolding. Annabelle stood beneath the bowed cross, small and serene, her eyes reflecting the warped shadows. She lifted her hand slightly, and the crucifix shivered again, as if acknowledging her touch. Dust fell from the rafters, coating the floor in a pale, choking haze. The altar cloth, blackened from melted wax and previous horrors, shifted, writhing as if animated by some unseen force. "Look," Annabelle whispered, her voice threading through the stone. "See what turns to obey me." The villagers tried to back away, but the shadows of the cross extended across the chapel like black water, curling around ankles and wrists, dragging them inexorably toward the altar. Panic erupted. Some screamed, some fainted. Some clawed at the walls and floor in vain. Yet no one dared touch Annabelle. Her presence seemed to tether the cross, bend it, command it. The crucifix groaned again, and the figure of Christ itself contorted. The arms stretched unnaturally, joints cracking, the head tilting forward so that his eyes, once gentle, once forgiving, fixed on Annabelle. The villagers noticed the face twisting in agony, the lips parting in a silent scream, yet the sound was swallowed by the chapel walls. The body sagged unnaturally, bones bending, as though the figure had grown soft, pliant, and alive. From the shadow beneath the cross, black tendrils of wax hardened over weeks began to slither along the floor. They crept along the edges of the pews, coiling around legs and feet, hissing softly as they clutched at the villagers. A woman screamed as her skirt was lifted, pulled by the black threads, and vanished beneath the shadow. Others scrambled, dragging themselves backward, yet the cross loomed larger, its shadow swallowing all in its path. Father Morrow, hands trembling, tried to reach the girl, to stop the impossible. "Annabelle! By God's mercy, cease this blasphemy." She did not turn, only smiled faintly. Her whispered words carried across the stone, curling into every ear. "He bends because he remembers. He bends because you forgot to see." The air thickened, heavy with the scent of decay and molten wax. Candle flames flickered violently, elongating the crucifix's shadow even further, until it seemed to merge with the chapel walls, forming a black river that lapped at the villagers' feet. The altar groaned under some invisible weight, the stones vibrating as if responding to the bending of the divine figure above. A young boy, frozen with terror, dared to look directly at the cross. His scream tore through the air as the figure of Christ reached with his elongated hands, not to bless but to clutch at him. The shadow of the crucifix surged forward, swallowing the boy whole, leaving only a faint outline on the stone floor. The other villagers recoiled, gasping, unable to look away from the spectacle, each of them seeing their own sins reflected in the warped figure above. The priest tried again, voice trembling into a prayer, "Forgive us. Deliver us, Lord, we are unworthy." But the cross bent farther, groaning, cracking. The wood seemed to ripple like liquid under some impossible force. The Christ above stretched, twisted, and then leaned fully forward, face mere inches from Annabelle. Its eyes, hollow and blackened, burned with something not human, not divine, something waiting, something tethered to her presence. Annabelle lifted her hand, and the crucifix seemed to shudder, then bow lower, almost touching the floor. Its shadow now reached the far wall, and the air between the altar and the last pew rippled, as if reality itself were bending toward the girl. The smell of iron and decay thickened, pressing on the lungs of all who remained. Then came a sound, low, wet, like tearing cloth and cracking bone. The altar itself groaned, shifting. Stones ground against each other, as if awakening from centuries of slumber. The bowing cross cast its shadow over the altar cloth, and from beneath it Annabelle's whispered words merged with the groaning wood. "Kneel, or be consumed. Watch or be forgotten." The black tendrils of wax surged higher, snaking up the walls, curling toward the vaulted ceiling. From the rafters, shadows began to pour downward, filling the chapel with a darkness that was not absence of light, but presence, something alive, watching. Waiting, the villagers stumbled backward, tripping over one another. But the shadow of the crucifix followed, relentless, growing, bending the very space around them. The smell of scorched wood and iron became overpowering. Every heartbeat thundered in the air, but it was no longer human. It was the pulse of the altar, of the chapel, of the bending divine. Father Morrow fell to the ground, clutching his cassock, eyes wide in disbelief and terror. "Lord, what? Where's this?" And Annabelle, small and still beneath the bowing cross, whispered one final word, low and certain, "He follows me." The crucifix shivered violently, bending fully toward her, shadows swallowing the remaining pews, the floor beneath it quaking as the chapel itself seemed to lean forward. The walls warped, the ceiling groaned, and in the far corner a single candle guttered out, dripping black wax onto the stones like blood. The silence arrived like a blade, sharp and absolute. One evening, as twilight bled across the village, Annabelle Grayson finally closed her mouth. No whisper, no tremor of breath, no faint echo of the dead slipped past her lips. The villagers had gathered in the chapel, trembling and hollow-eyed, awaiting the next horror, but nothing came. Even the air itself seemed to hold its breath, heavy and thick, as if waiting for something it could not endure. Candles burned low, their flames trembling, flickering like the pulse of a dying heart. Father Morrow, trembling, whispered a prayer into the thick, still air. God have mercy. But mercy had no place here. The church had become a tomb, a vessel of memory, and even in the absence of her voice the traces remained. Dust swirled along the altar rails, yet beneath it lay whispers of 1,000 tongues, tangled in echoes that only the faithful could hear. It was not her voice that haunted them now, but the absence of it, a vacuum that pulled at their minds, at their very souls. Annabelle stood at the center of the chapel, still as stone. Her pale face seemed to drink in the dim light, her eyes reflecting the long shadows of pews and altar. When she finally turned her gaze to the villagers, it was neither malicious nor gentle. It was the gaze of someone who had seen beyond and carried the weight of what she had summoned. The air recoiled, shifting, bending, thickening with a pressure that pressed upon their chests. "You will remember," she whispered once more, though the words were barely audible, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. And then she stepped forward, leaving the chapel, leaving the village, leaving the world she had reshaped with her words. The villagers, shaking and silent, watched her retreat into the encroaching fog, their hearts pounding like funeral drums. Yet when they dared to speak, their voices trembled, breaking into fragments that were not entirely their own. For even in her absence, her influence lingered. The church groaned as if adjusting to her departure. Shadows stretched long across the walls, moving subtly, carrying faint echoes of the voices she had commanded. Candles guttered, dripping black wax in long, sticky rivulets across the stone floors, and from the cracks in the altar, faint whispers slithered, threading themselves into the stones, the rafters, the pews, murmuring secrets that no one alive should know. Across the village, in every chapel, every sacred place that had once been thought safe, the walls remembered her. Whispers curled through the wood and stone, faint and deliberate, speaking her name in every darkened corner. Annabelle. Annabelle? Father Morrow knelt at the altar, clutching the crucifix, feeling the weight of centuries pressing against him. He shook violently, hearing her name echo through every fiber of his being. She is gone, and yet she is everywhere. The villagers fled in terror. Some ran into the streets, only to feel the same whisper curling around them like smoke. Others buried themselves in homes, slamming doors and shutters, yet the air still carried her presence, soft and insidious. No lock, no barrier could stop it. It was as if the world itself had taken note of her silence and remembered it forever. Even the church bells, long silent from fear and decay, began to toll of their own accord, slow and uneven, echoing across the fog-shrouded village. Yet their sound was hollow, ringing with the weight of something unseen, of voices long dead, of confessions left unspoken, of a child who had spoken what none should ever hear. And in the very center of every sanctuary, the altar seemed to breathe, pulsing faintly as though drawing in the memory of her words. Dust lifted in invisible currents, faint scratches marked the stone, and shadows coiled like living things in every corner. Every villager, no matter how far they fled, felt it, the imprint of her presence, indelible, eternal, whispering even when nothing moved, calling even when all was silent. Father Morrow rose, shaking, staring at the empty doorway through which she had vanished. The candlelight flickered violently, casting long, impossible shadows across the chapel walls. And then he heard it, a whisper so soft it could have been imagined yet undeniable, curling around his ear, threading into his mind. Do not forget. Do not forget. The wind carried her name outside, past the village, across fields and rivers, through forests that had never known her. Her silence was louder than any scream, her absence more present than any touch. She had left the world, and yet the world could not leave her. And in that final lingering moment, every villager understood the truth. She had spoken once, and the echoes would outlive them all. Every church, every stone, every shadow, every whisper, haunted eternally by the girl who spoke secrets no mortal should ever hear.